Total War, the series that was probably the best strategy franchise of all time. And now the franchise that makes you kind of grimace a little bit when you hear about it. It's actually had some sort of resurgence with Total War Pharaoh Dynasties. You know, they released a standalone game that brought in pretty much everything everybody wanted from a historical Total War, and it's been really well received. But what I wanted to do is take a deep dive into the swirling vortex of leaks, rumors, and, well, news surrounding the Total War franchise, and more importantly, what's happening with the developer Creative Assembly, because there's been a few new updates and, of course, whispers as well as what's coming next. And the amount of speculation, well, it's a bit insane. From Warhammer 40k to more DLCs for Warhammer 3 to potentially even a Star Wars title, there's so much to unpack here. So grab your favorite beverage and let's get started. First of all, let's talk about some of the leaks that have set the Total War community kind of excited. Legend of Total War, everybody knows. I don't need to explain who this guy is. He managed to turn out 50 million hour-long gameplay episodes every single day. Don't know how he does it. But he has mentioned that there are potentially several exciting projects in the pipeline. One of them, a Warhammer 40k Total War game, and not just a game, but potentially even a trilogy on the horizon. Doesn't seem that far-fetched since they already have a license here. Now, granted, it is Warhammer Fantasy and not even the Age of Sigmar license, and there are differences. Licenses come under different contracts, and 40k is not the same as Fantasy. So whilst we already do have a trilogy set in the Fantasy Warhammer world, that doesn't necessarily guarantee that Games Workshop will be so kind to give up their 40k franchise, especially since that is potentially and arguably the more lucrative of the two. But I don't see it being necessarily out of the question, because Creative Assembly are the biggest franchise that have ever really worked with Games Workshop before, and well, it's safe to say that the Warhammer Total War games have been a complete success, raking in more money and more players than any other Total War game to date, and no doubt has got people buying more Warhammer figures than they ever thought they could be buying. Granted, you can still only get one Ultramarine for about £30,000, but when it comes to Fantasy, you can at least get 3 Goblins for that same price, so there is a more lucrative deal there. Not just that, but the potential of a World War I Total War title. This is something that has actually been worked on in the past with mods. Of course, Napoleon Total War had a very famous World War I modification that actually worked pretty well. So we've seen the potential of it working. Of course, I don't think it could go past that. The most recent that we've really had within the Total War series is Napoleon and, well, Empire, which is a little bit further back, but using very similar technologies. But this only works because of that line warfare, standing in formations and shooting in volleys, much like we've seen in Total War in the past, using projectiles with, of course, arrows and crossbows. This kind of translated all right into musket warfare, but it still wasn't perfect, especially when they were changing engines. It was a little bit of a hiccup, let's say, at the start. But would it work with World War I? I think the Napoleon Total War World War I mod, as you're seeing on screen now, actually showed that it worked pretty well. Of course, you still have things like tanks that have been translated into the Total War Warhammer franchise, so we know that tanks will possibly work, and guns as well, which we've also seen gunpowder weapons in the Warhammer Total War franchise. So this could be a very high possibility, and I would absolutely love to see it. But for a reason that I'll get onto in a little bit, I think it's a bit less likely than something, well, of a more named brand. Not only this, but there's been a lot of speculation about what's going to happen with Warhammer Total War, because we're at the end of the trilogy now. I doubt we're going to get any more games in that vein, but an End Times DLC is a possibility for Warhammer Fantasy. And whilst Creative Assembly haven't confirmed any of these projects, there's been a lot of leaks that started to gain some traction because of their sources' credibility. Leaks are always a bit tricky, but Legend of Total War has a great reputation with the community, and the logical progression of these titles really represent, well, a lot for the franchise. Many fans, including myself, have started to find them quite plausible, since leaks that come out of Creative Assembly in the past have always stuck pretty well. And, well, there needs to be something that happens in this franchise, something quite drastic pretty soon in order to save it. They made the first move with Pharaoh's Dynasty, but it's still not going to be enough to get the fans back, and at least in a big way. After all, expanding into different eras and universes could be a great strategic move for CA to keep this franchise fresh, or at least bring the money back, which at the end of the day is the main aim for a company like this. Warhammer 3, though, has been a massive entry within the Total War series. I think it has been the biggest of the 3 Warhammer games, and I, for one, love it, especially with its focus on chaos. However, recent layoffs at Creative Assembly have actually cast a bit of a shadow on his future, especially since the last DLC was one of the worst rated DLCs that Creative Assembly have had. And my god, it caused so much controversy that there was a lot of people talking about that after the last few flops in Total War, this could have been the end of what we've seen for support for Warhammer 3, but it doesn't seem like that is going to be the direction, since there is still a lot of money that they could probably get out of this franchise. It is a very complex situation, and along with things like the cancellation of Hyenas, which was like their $1 million FPS game, Total War and CA are probably in a bit of a financial rut, even potentially Sega looking to sell the studio. Do I think that's going to happen? Not yet. I still think that there is a future for Creative Assembly, and whilst it's been 5-6 years of pretty much flop after flop, I still think they've made enough in order to get people back, especially with the Warhammer license. I mean, the cancellation of Hyenas just was an absolute disaster, and as much as Creative Assembly themselves have tried to play it down, 2023 was not the easiest year, especially since Pharaohs was so slated, and then Troy before it was so incredibly slated. Player numbers have been lower than they ever have in modern Total Wars, and the only games that people are still playing are the older ones that they've already owned for years. Creative Assembly aren't making more DLCs and things for things like Rome or Attila, so they're not really making much profit off people still playing it. And the games that they are bringing out, nobody seems to connect with. Then cancelling one of their biggest projects, a first-person shooter game, was an absolute disaster for them. And all these challenges have understandably caused some concern within the community. Because when you see a company that is at the helm of a massive franchise, it is always a bit shaky at where that's going to go. There's been speculation about significant staff reductions and talks of key personnel leaving the company. We had one of the Rome 2 developers come out a few months ago saying that it has been a mess since 2013, and this is just the pinnacle of the iceberg. A Creative Assembly that has been somewhat of a disaster for the last 10 or so years, and shaky with no real base layer in order to jump off. And of course, we've seen that within the games themselves, but that is something that is a knock-on effect from inherent problems within the company. And it takes years, if not, at this case, almost a decade, for these to really flow down into the game releases themselves. But we're starting to see that come into fruition. So hopefully there have been some real changes within them themselves. Not only this, but Creative Assembly has a recent foray into more of a live service model, which is met with a lot of criticism because of these overpriced DLCs with additional content that doesn't justify the cost. I mean, an argument could be made that Pharaoh being advertised as a full Total War game because of its price, and then having the content of a Sagas game or a spin-off title, is one of the worst decisions that they've made in the last few years. Luckily, it was followed by one of the best, which was to bring Dynasties with all the content from Troy and Pharaoh together, but it doesn't take away the issues that came before it. But what can they do? Well, I think Sega and Creative Assembly are going to probably shift to safe bets, kind of turtling the next bit of future. What I mean by that is they're going to be focusing on a lot less risky projects. So whilst there are rumors of a Warhammer 40k game, maybe a World War I game, and of course a potential Star Wars game, as I'll get onto it a little bit, I don't know if that's entirely going to be the option that they go with. Kit Guru reported this a while ago, and I kind of ignored it at the time because I thought it was so outlandish. But really, there is a lot there for a Total War game. I mean, we saw Empires of War, which was kind of an Age of Empires spin-off with Star Wars. I think Total War could do the same. There's such a big universe with rich possibilities for strategic gameplay, and, well, for Creative Assembly, a lot of extensive DLCs and expansions. Not to mention that, like Warhammer, it's such a global IP that there is an already pre-made audience for them. So it is bound to make a lot of money if they manage to do it. And I'm going to be honest, even if they mess it up, it's going to make a lot of money anyway. So whilst jumping into something like a Star Wars Total War might seem like a risk, I actually think that's one of their safe bets if they can already get the license for it. So where does this leave us? In a franchise of uncertainty, with some bits of hope dotted around there like Total War Pharaohs, there is a potential to conquer new realms and bring us new experiences and new universes. With Warhammer 40k, which I think could be great, World War I and even Star Wars. I think these are all fantastic choices, but really it all comes back to the base and the core of the franchise. A good historical Total War could set them up for something pretty special. Now, we were potentially going to get a Three Kingdoms 2, but that was allegedly cancelled back in 2022 down to some concerns about the Chinese market. I mean, we have actually some indicators in the franchise that point towards Three Kingdoms 2 being made, because they basically stopped support for the first Three Kingdoms way earlier than people expected. And I remember it was like a big hoo-ha. Everybody was wondering why they stopped bringing out support for the game, and I think it was potentially because they were working on a sequel that was eventually cancelled because of, well, a lot of the issues that I've spoken about. But a lot still has to be done, and despite the recent successes, I think they need to bring out good historical Total War. Will it be Medieval 3? That would be the safe bet, but once again, remember, the amount of pressure on their next title is insane. So they have to make sure that whatever they decide to go with, they put everything into it. No more weird DLCs with not enough content. No more labeling your game as a full title, but with half the content, but with the actual depth of a spin-off game. Just something transparent, something honest and true to the franchise that all of us fell in love with. That's what needs to come next. Because the future of Total War is on shaky ground, but I don't think it's over yet.